We're up to 3 reviews in the U.S. iTunes Store Marketplace of Ideas podcast listeners, so that means we are well on our way, but we probably still need your review as well. You can help the show get bigger, smarter, faster, stronger, whatever you want it to be, by leaving an iTunes review. Just search for the Marketplace of Ideas on iTunes, scroll to the bottom of the Marketplace of Ideas page in the directory, and there you can leave your star rating and leave your comments about the show as well, what you'd like to hear more of, less of, the same amount of, whatever. That is the Marketplace of Ideas on iTunes. Leave your review and help improve the show. Thanks, as always, ever so much. This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, we'll talk to Joshua Cohen, author of Witz, a novel about the last Jew on Earth. The Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Joshua Cohen is the author of the story collections The Quorum, Alphabet, and Bridge and Tunnel, and the novels Cadenza for the Schneidermann Violin Concerto and A Heaven of Others. His newest is his largest and most talked about so far, it seems to me. It's called Witz. Joshua, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, I want to... Oh, God, where do I even start with this book? I wanted to talk a little bit about the experience I had when I was looking up the reactions to it, having read it, and I mean, an experience I would characterize as being very enjoyably lost within it, in a sense. I read it and found a lot of people saying things like Dan Friedman said in the foreword, saying, "It's a shame no one will read this book." That seems to be... That's what you might call damning with faint praise. Is this the reaction you've seen? I mean, I can almost not believe that's what people are writing about it.
No, that's not what I've seen. I think that was, just like the book itself is a provocation. There have been a few reviews that have sought to provoke as well, and I think that was intended more as a provocation than as a true statement of Mr. Friedman's belief. But you'd have to ask him. I think a lot of the responses have been. I've expected a lot of the responses. Some of the responses have been fear or been sort of this, begrudged respect. And then, of course, there have been, the good reviews that have been heartening. But book reviewing in America today is such a fraught profession where, you're paid a few $100s to read a book of many hundreds of pages and then reduce it to 300 words that will go through 3 editors and then eventually find its way in a newspaper or onto a website. That to expect, 3 months after a book this large, a book 10 years in the making, to expect the reactions to be comprehensive or in any way have any intellectual depth or clarity is a little more than I would expect. And I've worked as a reviewer for years.
Indeed, and the first thing you said there, the first reaction you mentioned was fear. Now, what is this fear rooted in that you've seen so far?
Well, it's, I think it's gigantism. I think people don't want to read things this long. I think people don't want to read things this verbally dense. But also, politically, certainly, the subject matter tends to frighten. It tends to compromise people. People feel compromised when you tell them that you wrote a book about the last Jew in the world. They don't know how to take it. They don't know whether it's a piece of propaganda or a satire.
Yes, that's what's always mentioned first, is that Joshua Cohen has written this book, Witz, about the last Jew on Earth. That's always the point that's made first. And yeah, technically that's a very valid point to make about the content of this book. But at the same time, reading it, I wasn't thinking so much about the sort of speculative scenario of what would it be like if there was one Jew on Earth and what would be the actual consequences. I was thinking more about, I don't know, that particular Jew stopped becoming what I thought about, and I just started thinking about the language. It became, for me, almost entirely about the language. Is that a reaction you would expect from a reader?
Oh, I don't know what to expect from a reader. I mean, I know that I wanted a book I wanted the book to be about its language. I wanted the book to interrogate its own materials, mostly because I have this. I think anyone today, any Jew in America today, sort of doubts the fabric of his own or her own religion. There's just so many ways of identifying as Jewish today, and so many conflicting ideological ways. Certainly, so many conflicting political ways that the manner in which one can be Jewish that can sort of encompass all of these is language. Is just this enormous instrument of language, which is a mixture of Yiddish and Yiddish English and sort of showbiz shtick and stage patter, and the translations of the Bible into this sort of high King James thing that has come down in more like Reform Judaism. There's just so the language is just so rich, and it can combine so many different political points of view and religious observant points of view that the book had to be about its language and had to immerse people in that language.
When you began writing the book nearly a decade ago, as we've said, did you know this book had to be about its language, or did that come to you during the process?
Oh, sure. I mean, the people I want to be part of exist only in language. There was no doubt from the beginning that this book was going to live and die by the word, by the sentence. That there was going to be an attempt to pile everything into it linguistically, all the languages of the diaspora, all the languages of the liturgy, and that it was going to have to be a private language ultimately. When you write a book that's very long, you tend to think it's a very public book. You tend to think it's a book that wants to encompass the world. And so the idea was to have a book that took the form of a very public book, but in a very private language, in a language that nobody necessarily speaks in, but that is my personal concoction of the languages of the diaspora, of the languages of Jewish tradition, of Scripture, of the language of my family, and certainly the language of media, of the Borscht Belt, of Jewish comedy, of film.
And it seems, hearing this about this concoction of the language you've made in this book, I think about myself, and I'm not Jewish, and I certainly haven't spent any time immersed in Jewish culture, but I still enjoyed the language, and I still enjoyed the book. It seems like that's somehow something that I shouldn't have been able to do, is enjoy it on, maybe it was a different level. I'm not sure. Have you heard reactions from non-Jewish readers and about them still enjoying this stuff that's full of resonances for people who are Jewish, people who know Judaism, but the ones who don't, at least if I'm going to use myself as an example, still find it funny, still find it really smart. And I guess that's a good thing, but is it something that you designed in? Well,
I mean, I think if you'll forgive me, the question behind that question is, what kind of a reader am I writing for?
Sure, why not?
And the truth is that I don't think about the reader. I certainly don't think if I'm writing for a Jewish audience or a non-Jewish audience. I don't think I'm writing for an audience at all. It's not. I'm writing to satisfy myself, and I'm writing to the standard of. I'm writing to my own standard, and I'm writing to my own pitch. And I certainly, this book certainly would be different were I to gauge somebody's level of, Jewish literacy. One thing that I always think about is if you read a lot of the books in Yiddish, the Yiddish books that were translated into English right after the war, you see that all of the Yiddish terminology and some of the Hebrew terminology given in italics, in italic print.
Right.
And that sort of served to take these foreign words and exoticize them even more. And I wanted to have no italic words. I wanted to incorporate any foreignisms, any exotic terminology into the very flesh of the English, into the very flesh of the book. And when you do that, you can't think of the reader. You can only think of the effect that it produces in yourself. And I don't see any difference in a word in Hebrew and a word in Yiddish and a word in English. These are all words I would use interchangeably and are part of my, pan-linguistic language, my own language.
There's a couple ironies here that I feel like I should get into a bit. Number one being the irony that by taking away the sort of buffer between the elements of Jewish culture you include here, especially the words you pull straight from non-English languages. As you said, you don't italicize them. There's not a lot of padding. There's some explanation, but not, a huge buffer of explanation about everything in the book. And as well, writing in this language that you've made, not thinking about the reader, thinking in a way that makes what you would think would be an insular book. Both of these things have somehow, at least for me, made the book more approachable, not less, and I felt like I can inhabit it more, not less. See, if you know what I mean, like making it somehow more foreign, gave it less of that distance of exoticism. Making it more personal to you has somehow made it more accessible to me. Does this make any sense whatsoever when I'm describing something?
No, it does. I mean, I appreciate it as praise, and I would say in answer to that is that we're surrounded by explanation. We're surrounded by information, and I've had enough of it. I mean, my thought was if anybody didn't know a word, they could look it up, and it's easier to look things up than ever. I mean, right. we live in a culture of information, a culture of information transmission, and beyond that, beyond the very fact that there's the internet and that we're all sort of connected to these highs of knowledge. Beyond that, the conservative art products of our age just seek to condescend to us through explanation. They want to get on their knees and put their hands on our knees and sort of slowly and patiently make sure that the reader is never lost. Because to lose the reader is to lose a sale. And so I really one of my ideals, my true ideal, my concept of the ideal book is the book that never explains, that never contextualizes, and that trusts that the reader is every bit as intelligent as the writer, or every bit as curious as the writer, curiosity being more important than intelligence, and that they'll come along. And I really feel that the old element of storytelling was suasion, was the idea to persuade the reader to appeal to their curiosity, as opposed to now it's a sort of calculating explanation. It's a sort of patient plotting to ensure that the book is accessible on all levels to all types of readers. And that's something that I have no patience with. I can't read it. I don't care about it. I think that's one reason, for example, that the third-person omniscient novel has grown very boring to me, because the conservatisms in place when people didn't know all these things about, a peasant or a middle-class person in Russia wouldn't know about the aristocracy, and then they read War and Peace, and they suddenly know how the aristocracy lived. We know how everyone lives. We have magazines for this. We have newspapers for this. When we have the internet for this, we have movies for this. Books, literature can't do that. We have all the information. We know how the other exists. Now we just need to know how they feel, or how an individual processes this information, how an individual refracts it and presents it poetically.
There's a concept here of trusting the reader, respecting the reader as the flip side of what's seen as challenging the reader, or throwing down a gauntlet for the reader. And it is fascinating to me that I can read a lot of reviews of the book and they say, "Oh, Witz is challenging. Oh, it's going to be so hard." And of course, yes, I had difficulty with it. It took me a long time to read. Because of the amount of text, there were many parts where I couldn't tell you what was going on. Yet I still at every moment found, hey, this is really funny. This is text I've never read before. This is something different. And I want to ask you this: when you're trying to trust a reader, when you're trying to assume they're as intelligent as the book that they're reading, Is there really as much of a downside as, the public discussion would say that there is? That, well, you do that and you're never gonna have anybody read it. Does it actually turn people off as much as one might say, or have you found that's not the case?
Well, I mean, I can only speak for, I don't know. I mean, I can only speak for myself. I've never been. Everyone has underestimated the reader, and I don't really believe I've ever been overestimated. So, I don't know that. I don't know the answer to that. Me personally, I'll read anything and I will come to it, and take it for what it speaks to me. I honestly don't know how to answer that question. I mean, I take, for example, with all respect, like this interview. This is an interview so far where we've just discussed the reactions to the book and not the book itself.
Right.
Truthfully, the entire context of how a book is received can't be obvious to a writer. Can't be obvious to me because I've lived with this book for a decade. I have friends and family who've read it. I've had friends and family who haven't read it, and their reception or their acceptance or rejection of the book is not an acceptance or rejection of me, nor is it an acceptance or rejection of any philosophy of literature that I have. It's just the book exists, and the book will continue to exist, and at a certain point it will find readers, or it won't.
Indeed. And I want to get, especially, you talk about living with the book for so long, and I want to go back to the beginning of you living with this book, back to the origins of it, back to the very seeds of Witz. And I mean, we've talked about some things, some elements of literature with which you perhaps have been dissatisfied. Perhaps this is a corrective. But what else formed the very seeds of this project when you first began it? Certainly feeling that I was living at the confluence of two deaths, the confluence of two mortalities. One is that I was born in 1980. I think my generation will be the last generation that will know personally survivors of the Holocaust, and that after they pass, all testimony will be secondhand. Will be books, will be documentaries, will be recorded interviews, and so on. And but yet people my age, people in their 20s, have the opportunity to meet firsthand the victims and hear not only hear the stories, the testimony that has become stories, but also to see the triumph of life afterwards, and also to see the toll. But certainly feeling that generation, which was my grandparents' generation and immigrant generation, see that generation passing. And then at the same time, what has been sold to us as the death of the book, or at least as the decline of the primacy of the book as an idiom or as a medium of communication of our, let's say, of our culture, as the essential element of our culture, and so living at the confluence of these mortalities, you begin to realize that everything. I begin to realize that the way in which I was raised and the culture in which I was raised, the cultures in which I was raised, were fading away. I mean, my house was full of books growing up, and suddenly I'm told that books are not in the future. My house was full of stories of 1,000 years of European Jewry that formed my grandparents, and that generation was dying. And then when I was in my early 20s, I lived for a while in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe, and worked for a few newspapers out there, magazines, and did a lot of reporting on the kind of the Jewish aspect of a number of these capitals and countries after the fall of communism. What was happening to the elderly Jewish communities of what was left of them of Prague, of Budapest, of Warsaw, and so on, and so spending a lot of time on trains, kind of crossing the eastern part of that continent, looking at cemeteries that were destroyed for ice hockey stadiums, or Holocaust survivors that weren't receiving health benefits, and also just taking in the landscape. And so
those were all antecedents to the book. And then, of course, the reading. I mean, the reading that I've always done, the reading that I've done in Jewish literature from a number of languages, and the idea that I wanted to write some sort of to bring to an end that period of my life, to write a terminal text to that period of my life, a terminal text about the terminal, about I didn't want to live, and I don't want to live thinking about the Holocaust. I don't want to live thinking about books to which I've given my life disappearing. So it was an attempt to sort of frame all of these anatopsical thoughts between two covers.
And standing at the confluence of these two deaths you discuss, this doesn't seem like the work of a man who, at that point, actually accepts at least the death of the book, as you've termed it. This doesn't seem like the work of a man who thinks the book is going away in all seriousness, is it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the book is not leaving me. The book, no one's going to come to my house, seize my books. I mean, I probably can't give my books away. I don't know. I don't know what to say. I do know that I think people are reading less. That I have friends who read less now than they read 10 years ago. I don't know. I have no predictions to that end. But I certainly think that I certainly don't see many books like my book, and I'm not saying that from a position of egotism. I'm saying that it's an observation. I see books that I see books that are packaged. I see books that look like books. I see books that smell like books, and books that feel like books. But I don't hear the music of books from them. I hear some sort of calculation. I hear some sort of market judgment. I don't know, or at least I haven't been able to read that many contemporary novels or novels by my contemporaries.
And even so, I do. This makes me ask something I just have to know about. Some of the articles I've read about you and about this book have also taken the line that Joshua Cohen does not like any of your favorite authors of Jewish novels, and I wonder. I don't want to sensationalize any statements you've made here. I do want to say that I want to ask how much of the actual writing of this book, not the press, not the reviews, how much of the actual writing of this book was driven by a reaction of yours to what might be considered what people have called Jewish novels?
Oh, I mean, a lot of it. I mean, certainly, the press aspects of it sensationalize it, and certainly shouldn't give interviews when drunk. But the writing of the book was absolutely a reaction against the happy endings of the Holocaust literature and of the Jewish novels that I grew up reading. The sense that one can write about an enormous historic catastrophe and yet frame it in sort of, I live to tell the tale terms, just doesn't seem important to me anymore. I mean, I'm sure it had its cultural function, but it doesn't resonate with me. I prefer the Yiddish literature of the Holocaust to the American literature of the Holocaust, and certainly the writers of, let's say, a radical negativity have always appealed to me over writers who try to find a sense of meaning where there isn't one, where there's just a void. I find that most of the Jewish art, let's say, tends toward a sort of sweetness, a treacly or a saccharine sweetness that tends to value a poetic feeling over historical fact. And I was kind of impatient with that. I mean, not that I'm a fan of historical fact, because this is an entirely counterfactual book, but I think that you can't take. I don't like the idea of exampling one fictional character's happiness without, in some way, conveying the idea that happiness is had against a backdrop of the suffering and the deaths of millions.
Nobody has called Witz a happy book, or a book with a sunny outlook, certainly. But at the same time, reading the book, I mean, I was laughing a lot. I was really enjoying it. And I I at the same time felt happier about the possibilities of literature despite the bleakness of the book's content. And this is kind of this is a contradiction I'm not sure I can reconcile, and I don't even know if I have a good question to ask about it. But is this what can you say about that kind of reaction that at least as for me as a reader was predominant over the course of this? The fact that this book is impressively, to my mind, innovative with text, and it does all these things I'm impressed by, and yet at the same time, it's a book that should not be making me happy in any sense. I should come away. I feel like I should come away more sad than I was before. What do you think's going on there?
Well, I mean, I think it's the whole 20th century education thing. I think it's the laughter through tears, the idea that the Galgen humor, the gallows humor. I think it's everything that we, meaning the world, not just Jews, learned from Jewish European culture, especially East European culture, which is the idea that your only weapon is humor, that your only that it's no consolation, but it is a defense, and it's all of that Ashkenazi weakness that Israel rails against, and that. But for me, it's an essential lesson, but it's also an inheritance that I'd like to question. The idea that everything can sort of be laughed at, that powerlessness is the great, humorous, beautiful, tragic, heroic response to power, and that in powerlessness is great power because of the mechanism of humor that can embarrass people in power, that can embarrass or humiliate the oppressor. These are all traditions that or ideas that come very natural to me, and I think that's behind the idea that's behind the concept. You can read something that's very depressing, but still find some humor in it, still find some dignity in it, and even some sort of redemption, even if it is like a stilted one. But also, there's a criticism of that. I mean, there's an implied criticism, because I'm not sure that inheritance, the laughter through tears inheritance, is useful. I'm not sure it's politically useful. I certainly think it's better that Israel has an army than it has jokes. I think armies are sometimes more effective than jokes, but it's an attempt to find out how I feel about that inheritance. I mean, I was always it was osmotic. It was the idea that whenever anything bad happened to you, you would immediately find the humor in it, because you were just an abject creature. And that being a victim is a funny thing. I don't know how well that served me. I certainly know that it might have created a good book, but it might have created a good person or a well-adjusted person.
I take it it's no coincidence that we find at the core of Witz a powerless character, a character who in a sense wields, in a sense he is powerful because he wields influence over the world in a way by his very existence, but it's not influence he can actually use. It's a powerful powerlessness, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is that he's a person that that has no interest in Judaism, no knowledge of Judaism, but yet is the last vestige of Judaism, and so that is it's terrible to be a conscious symbol, to be a symbol who's constantly reminded that they're also that they also should be a human being or could be a human being. And that's certainly the idea with Benjamin Israelien.
And this character is one that in a way I can't quite stop thinking about this character because of a lot of things. But number one, the image of a character born with a beard and glasses obviously is one that sticks with you. But in the same sense, it makes one wonder about the origins of this character. Can you tell me about the process that got you to at least the point where you knew this would have to be the type of kind of man-child at the center of the book?
I mean, there was no thinking behind it. It was just how many how many cliches and stereotypes can we sort of, boil up in a pot, and then can we pour into a skin and then sew it up?
Yes.
It's really it's the tradition of the schlemiel, it's the tradition of the schlemazel, it's the tradition of the guy who can do no right. It's the man who would lose even his own shadow. It's helplessness, but it's also that great sort of absent-minded transcendence that you see in so many, Jewish intellectuals being, the only heroes of Jewish life, really, or at least in the European sphere. All of that came very naturally. There was very little conscious construction. This character needed to be a sort of fully formed archetype.
And the world that he finds himself in becomes one where Judaism it's kind of a Judaism of, kitsch is the word that gets used a lot in the ways it's been written about, but it's like, I think of it as the Judaism of a lot of superficial stuff. The Judaism of an accretion of detritus is kind of what it becomes in a world where most of the Jews are gone. As far as the way this world would look, is this something you knew when you started Witz, or is it something that developed as you wrote it? You found this was the world it just happened to become as you started from your premises and worked outward?
I think it was Novelist who said that every book should contain its counter book, its opposite, and it was certainly my thought that this book had to show a world in two sections: a world without Jews, in which all of the cultural institutions fall apart, in which all of the banking institutions fall apart, in which everything goes to and rack and ruin, and then there needs to be the counter book, the opposite. There needed to be there's the scripture and then the negative scripture where people repopulate Jewry by converting or by converting themselves, and so that very clear, very schematic structure was there from the beginning. The details filled themselves in as I wrote, and again, it was a very long process of writing. Actually, it was a short process of writing. It was a very long process of rewriting. But the book needed to be structured as a joke or as a series of jokes. But really, it was a proposition. All the Jews die. And then the proposition is complicated and complicated and complicated as propositions or setups and jokes are. And the furnishing of a punchline in this book is a punchline as long as the setup. There's a punchline that essentially reverses the setup and saying, you want to hear something funny in response to this, well, we're going to give you a funny reality. We're going to give you a reality in which a world without Jews just becomes a more Jewish world.
If you've just tuned in, this is The Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is Joshua Cohen, author of Witz, a novel about the last Jew on planet Earth. You can hear this episode again or any other interview in our archive at colinmarshallradio.com or search for The Marketplace of Ideas on iTunes. If you have any feedback, questions, comments, negative, positive, whatever you have, send that along to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. Now, back to the conversation with Joshua Cohen. And the idea of structuring the book in that way, structuring the book as a joke. Obviously, anybody who hears a translation of the title will, and you don't have to hear a translation. You can see it in the book as you start it. It's pointed out. In fact, I want to get an idea of, because this is a book that there doesn't seem to be just one structure. There's also there's substructures here. It seems to me like, and you had this notion of the book structured as a joke. Where does it go from there in terms of thinking about the ways you want to structure the structures below that? Because it seems in the reading experience, you can see on the surface that there's structural changes. But was that a natural progress from this idea of structure as joke?
The book is structured as a joke in the sense that it's cut in half. It's just cut right down the middle as a world without Jews and a world of all Jews. Mm-hmm. It's the thought of, let's have the beginning of a book being none and the end of a book being all. The local structure, let's say, was really just the idea for that was born from the idea of the Jewish calendar of leading some sort of, what's the word, diachronic life. We have, next month is September, but it's also Tishrei, where two separate months overlap. So the book itself actually combines two concepts of time. The book is structured according to the Jewish calendar, and certainly it takes into account the New Year and Passover, and the book begins on the eve of the millennium, the eve of the secular New Year, and all the Jews die out on the eve of the next Pesach and Passover, representing an alternate New Year in the Jewish year. But and then also the book is structured according to the progress of the Bible, of the Torah. There's that large section that is the Exodus section where he's wandering, where Benjamin Israelien is wandering across America throughout the Southwest. So it was an attempt to overlap the calendar with Torah narrative as a sort of reflection of what it means to live a double life. Also, you would notice that the secular calendar itself ebbs as the book continues and gives itself entirely over to the Jewish calendar. So that accounts for the local structure. I mean, and there are all sorts of niceties to keep grad students scurrying for years. So that certainly wasn't the intention. Mostly the intention was to gratify me, which might be even a more narcissistic intention. But the book was rigorously structured only because when you're writing in a highly verbal, highly elusive style, it's very easy to go on forever and ever. And though some people might believe I've gone on forever and ever, there are reasons I begin where I begin and I end where I end.
There also does seem to be a practical governor here in the sense that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've read that you wrote the original manuscript longhand. Am I right about that?
I wrote large portion of the original manuscript by longhand. Yeah, I mean, when the original manuscript that I wrote longhand was a couple hundred pages, but that soon ballooned to a few thousand pages once it became, like everything else today, computerized. But yeah. I mean, and I still write first and sometimes second drafts of things longhand. Absolutely.
And why is that? What does it give you? What does it give you in terms of the way you can process the language while you are crafting the language?
Well, I mean, you never know if what you do is because of superstition or because you believe it truly works. But I don't know. I think that when you write by hand, you tend to write by ear, and when you write on a screen, you tend to write by sight. You want the words to look a certain way on a page when they're just so neat and the font is so uniform and you can move things around. But the only guide when you write by hand, especially when your hand is as sloppy as my hand is the ear. And I so that's what I tell myself. But I don't know what the truth is. I don't know. Also, sometimes it's fun to write in bed. Sometimes it's good to write on the train. Sometimes you have to write standing up, waiting for your drink.
Indeed. That adaptability to various settings, I think, is an important quality in a writer. Now, there's something I want to get into here that is it's maybe verges on a little bit too abstract, but it still was an issue that I couldn't put down while reading Witz, which is that being someone who's not Jewish, who doesn't come from a Jewish family, a lot of my encounters with Judaism have been through literature. And in a large way, for me, people talking about Jewish subjects is almost exclusively the domain of books, of texts, of stories. And I don't know what resonance that has in the wider world, but this Witz did seem like a pretty big break, even from Jewishness is maybe even a better word, as a purely literary entity. And since you come from the background, I don't know how much you would have thought about it as purely represented in books, but I mean, is that a subject that crosses your mind the way that you have, yes, Judaism, the thing itself, but you also have the thing whose ambassador to a lot of people is mainly in books. I mean, literature is where I got a lot of this stuff whose references I understood in Witz in the first place.
Sure. I mean, I I've never been interested in ambassadorship because I always believe that it presents some sort of false face. I mean, I don't want to write a representative Jewish book.
Right.
I don't know what a representative Jewish book is. I mean, I think it's the Torah, but if you read the Torah, it's insane. It has nothing to do with Jewish life today. I don't know. I will say that I've never been interested in the public face of something. I've always been interested in what goes on behind it. I never want to hear. Whenever I'm on a tour, I know that the last person I have to listen to is the tour guide. I'm not.
Well put.
I'm not interested in the official response, in the official version, in the press secretary, in the talking head. I like shop talk. I like the way people talk behind counters. I like the way people talk in kitchens. I like I think that shows the true face, that shows the authentic face. It's not in this sort of Marxist history from the ground up way, but just in the way that people are honest, and that there's sense when you're composing something for consumption on a large scale, or at least for consumption by people with a large range of capabilities and a large range of experiences coming at it from different backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. You water it down. You never get the true product. You never get the echt experience, they say. So I've never once thought about writing anything representative. I've never once thought about giving someone a book that can show them what Judaism is. And in fact, if you read any of these books, like What is Judaism, that they use these kind of airport type books, it doesn't communicate any aspect of Jewish life to me. I mean, what and I don't think they would to anyone. I mean, the essence of any idea is always at its periphery and never at its center, because its periphery shows that someone is alienated from it, but yet is to some degree inexorably attracted to it or inexorably a part of it. And it's that tension that actually can be made universal, because anyone can understand the tension between feeling you're part of something and feeling you're not part of something, feeling you're an individual and you're some sort of participant in the collective. And I think that people respond to the periphery. I think people should emotionally respond to the periphery, but yet they fool themselves into wanting a broad statement, into wanting a sort of fat center. And I'm not sure how much that has to do with the dissemination organs of publishing, or whether that's just the idea of having to put on a public face and conduct yourself. I don't know what that's from, but I know that I've always been interested in what goes on in back of the man behind the curtain.
You bring up that word authenticity, and it's a word I hear brought up I overhear is a better word for me to say here. I overhear it brought up in conversations to do with Judaism, saying what is authentically Jewish, and a lot of these very broad questions. I take it then, and this is what I felt reading Witz. These are the notions of authenticity you are precisely not concerned with.
Which notions do you mean? You mean like? Which notions of authenticity you're referring to?
Exactly. Maybe that's the core of my question, because
whose authenticity?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and the question might be, maybe there's a meta question of authenticity that's more interesting here. It's articles I see flit by on the internet where people will write about, worrying a little bit about how do we define what's authentically Jewish and what isn't. And maybe there's a meta question here of, what authenticity is authentic? I mean, your brain kind of turns off at a certain point, but does that sort of, at what level of that conversation interests you, if any?
Well, I mean, all levels of that conversation interest me. I mean, I think that authenticity is the great subject today. I think that the beginning of modernity has this interest in authenticity when we find that we can reproduce things, when we can make multiple copies of an artwork. We suddenly ask ourselves, what is the authentic? We become sort of medievalists interested in the relics of saints when we want, the original of something, the first manuscript, that the original manuscript that then becomes, the book, and or the sketch, or the original painting that then gets reproduced in every textbook and on everyone's computer screen. We're interested in authenticity, but now it has left the realm of the product, or left the realm of the object, and entered the realm of the subject, where we ourselves are questioning what is it to be an authentic person, because we live, in we live in a time of incredible freedom, and in a country of incredible freedom, where all of these ethnic categories and religious categories that had sort of kept people and controlled people and persecuted people, but at the same time provided them comfort for generations, have eroded, and we are mixed race and mixed religion and mixed linguistic, and it's a huge, beautiful jump up and down in like the piss puddle mess. And that is, this sort of hybridity is the great American contribution. And I will, and I would in no way question the value of it. But also we need to recognize that what comes with that freedom is a sense of law. Is not only the idea that all of these signposts and guides have been eradicated. No longer we don't know what's expected of us, what we should do, what the laws governing our behavior are, what the laws governing what we should eat, when we should pray, when we should go to sleep, what do we say have to go to the bathroom. But all these things have gone away, and we need to realize that they've left us with a sort of spiritual void that can't be filled by purchasing power, and can't be filled by I don't know. They can't be filled. And maybe they can be filled by art that questions notions of authenticity. But one of the great pleasures of watching the Obama election was, here's a man who came from everywhere, which is to say to come from nowhere, and yet he found the narrative that got him elected was how this was the most American thing in the world, and from that he created this picture of an all-American family, and he made himself an all-American family. He married into a sort of dynasty and or a Chicago dynasty at least, and had and has this kind of picture perfect American family with children, and they lived in a nice house, and he worked his way up, and he became president of the United States of America. And this is a man who came from nowhere, but yet he can only find meaning in a sort of embrace of this American authenticity, which is this stable family. And but I think that there has to be, and I'm not going to psychoanalyze the president, but I think there has to be some sort of voice, a questioning of who I would have been in another situation, who I would have been in another context, who I would have been when there were less threats of freedom, let's say. People talk about the threats to freedom, and they're very afraid to talk about the threats of freedom. And but I think that there's no doubt that there is some sort of void.
And when you ask yourself questions about who you would have been if you were in this other set of circumstances, some other set of circumstances, how much sense do you find it makes to yourself to ask a question about who you would be if you were someone else? Because that original you is it kind of disappears, does it not? You're not you. Sure. And these are all insane fantasies. These are all, for example, even being Jewish, I'm a mess. My mother's Jewish, my father's Jewish. As far as I know, Jews going back forever. And yet within that, I'm a complete mess. My grandparents on one side are called Yekas. They're German Jews from Cologne, Germany, very wealthy, very assimilated, three-piece suits, a Weihnachtsbaum, a kind of Hanukkah tree for Christmas time, and on the other side, they're basically, Hungarian peasants, Hasidic Hungarian peasants, and or Hungarian, Romanian, Slovak, Ukrainian, right on that border. And so it's within every purity are 1,000 mongrel idioms sort of straining against each other and devouring each other and claiming precedence. So it's a useful exercise to think how you would have been, but I'm not really sure that it's anything but an exercise. But the point of the exercise, I think, is to realize that everyone creates for themselves their own tradition, and that we have the freedom to create for ourselves our own tradition. But that within that we probably shouldn't abandon. It's going to sound terribly conservative, but you shouldn't abandon certain values that have remained constant and remained useful. And by values, I mean nothing that could be associated with the Republican
party. I mean things like literacy, things like responsibility to cultural memory and to collective memory.
When I think about this book, and it's thinking about it hasn't really slowed down for me, especially since, of course, I was preparing to interview you about the book. But even after this interview, I don't think that this is going to be out of my mind anytime soon. And I don't think, in a way, I don't think the book is done with me in a way. I mean, yes, I have read the words on the pages, but at the same time, I do feel like I can and will be drawn to re-enter it at a variety of points, just sort of to experience the language of different parts of it. And I feel like I can. I feel like I'm allowed to do that, to go back in, wherever, and to exist in it for a while. But how much of that could you consider a recommended reading practice of this book? I feel like it's almost meant for me to do that,
Sure. I mean, there's scenes, there's set pieces, and certainly there are discontinuities in the text that would lend themselves to being read as excerpts, read separately. I didn't really write a book that was supposed to be an encyclopedia or a dictionary, some sort of reference book to be dipped into. But I think, how about this? If anyone makes it through 800 pages, they can then reread wherever they want.
Fair enough.
With my blessing.
The book, once again, is called Witz, Joshua Cohen. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
If you'd like to learn more about Joshua Cohen and Witz, visit joshuacohen.org. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. You can hear this one again or any other interview in our complete Marketplace of Ideas show archive at colinmarshallradio.com. And the website of the man who makes our theme music, Ben Althouse, is available at benalthouse.com as well. Be sure to send your questions, comments, any kind of feedback you could ever possibly happen to have to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com, and that would be very much appreciated. Thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.